Revit 2025 dropped today. Let's take a look at who's currently using the software. So looking at my stats here, got some people who have currently downloaded it. I've got a couple BIM managers who are checking it out for compatibility, loading up some of their families. I do have one engineer, he's got it installed, and he's waiting for his projects to convert. So, not a whole lot of people using Revit 2025 yet. Instead of taking a look at Revit 2025, let's take a look over the past year and see who's been using Revit 2024 and earlier. I have usage stats from the software that we sell. It's an electrical add-in for Revit, helps with single line diagrams and things like that. I think we can extrapolate from there to see the usage of the various versions of Revit. Let's start by taking a look at what percentage of people over the last year have used each version of Revit. If you add up these percentages, they're going to be over 100% because most people are using more than one version of Revit. So we're looking here at all the people who've been using our software, which versions of Revit they've been using. You can see that the two dominant versions of Revit in the last year have been Revit 2022 and Revit 2023. Looks like about 70% of the people have used one of those versions of Revit. Then you have a fall off on either side. You got about 25% of the people who've been using Revit 2024. And on the other side, you have 20% of the people who are still using Revit 2021 or Revit 2020. I did look at a couple other ways to slice this data, and you basically get the same answer no matter how you're parsing this data based on people using it or number of commands run. We'll stick with this one set of numbers, who's used the version of Revit on a project at all. That graph was for usage over the entire year. Let's take a look at how that usage has changed over the course of the year. So this is the usage broken down by month. Looking at each version of Revit in turn, you can see that Revit 2024 has steadily increased. Obviously, when it was first released in April of last year, not very many people were using it. And over the course of the year, more and more people were using it. And at this point, about 25% of you are currently using Revit 2024 in a project. Revit 2023 started the year strong and has seen increasing usage over the course of the year. So there's a lot of projects happening in Revit 2023. Looking at Revit 2022, it's been used quite a bit on a lot of projects over the course of the year, though that usage has been dropping as the year has gone on. Then looking at Revit 2021 and 2020, those are clearly on their way out, not being used in a whole lot of projects. So how I would interpret these graphs is that, in general, you don't upgrade your version of Revit on a project. If you start it in Revit 2022, you're going to finish that project in Revit 2022. The upgrade process adds unnecessary complexity and risk to a project that's in process. So looking at the numbers, Revit 2022 and 2023 are what I would consider the current versions of Revit over the last year. That's what most projects are being done in. That's the version of Revit that if you see a project in that, you're not going to really think twice. That's kind of the standard version of Revit that's been being used. Anything older than that is probably going to feel old. So if you have a Revit 2021 or a Revit 2020 or anything older than that, those are projects that are kind of feeling old and a bit long in the tooth. Those are versions of Revit where you're either hoping that project finishes up soon so you don't have to upgrade it, or you might actually consider upgrading it at that point. If you got a project that's in a version of Revit that old and it's got a really long time frame where you're still working on it at this point, you might consider upgrading that because it's a project you're going to be working on for a while and you don't want to be using Revit 2020 a couple years from now. So you might actually upgrade that project. And finally, if you're using Revit 2024 on a project in the last year, that's the ones that are really feeling very new. They're either brand new projects or ones that you've upgraded. So if you've been using Revit 2024, that kind of feels like you're on the cutting edge of what you're doing in Revit. Looking forward to next year, if we take this graph and we slide it over, you can see that the endpoints kind of match up between the different years. So what was happening with Revit 2024 last year is what we can anticipate is going to happen with Revit 2025 this year. Obviously, no one's going to be using it right now. And in a year, there's probably going to be 25% of you who've actually used it on a project. Going forward, Revit 2024 and 2023 are going to feel like the current versions of Revit. Those are the ones that you're not going to really think about when you're using that version of Revit. It's kind of standard. So Revit 2022 is going to start to feel old, and obviously anything older than that is going to be an old project at this point. So right now, no one's using Revit 2025 because it just came out. Probably a quarter of you who are currently using Revit 2024. That number is going to increase over the year. You're going to see lots of new feature videos talking about Revit 2025, and for most of you, that's just not going to be very relevant. So this is your opportunity to actually go back in the archives of YouTube, find those Revit 2024 new feature videos. Take a look at the new features that came out last year and see what you're going to get to use this year as you convert your projects and start new projects on that version. I've got a video on new features in Revit 2024 for electrical engineers. So if you're an electrical engineer, you can check that out. If you're not an electrical engineer, you can check out the other videos from other channels to see the new features that came out in Revit 2024. Once I've had a chance to play with Revit 2025, I will be doing a new features for electrical engineers video. I'll also be taking a look at some specific things like how to calculate voltage drop in Revit 2025. Make sure to subscribe to the channel so you can be alerted when those new videos are available.